Hey everyone, this is Andy Malbuff, and in this video we're going to take a look at using variables in Desmos Activity Builder in the computation layer. Variables allow the user to define certain conditions and to use those conditions throughout that component and maybe even to tie it into other components. So let's get started in taking a look at variables. First, I want to give you a preview of what a variable input could look like here. So what we're looking at is a student screen preview where we're going to use variables. And the first thing I want to take a look at, I want to highlight this part right here. We can use a variable to display numeric input. Now, right now, here's the display of that, and that's undefined at this point because the student has not entered any numeric input. If the student enters a number such as 5, that displays right here. And whatever number, whether it be negative, positive, could even be an example of something like pi, will display right here. We can also set variables to display LaTeX input. LaTeX input is where we use mathematical expressions and math type and terminology. So an example of that in this particular input might be if a student were to type in an expression, 3x squared, that will display right here. So how do we go ahead and make that happen? I'm going to leave the preview mode here, and I'm going to take you into a second screen right here that's got the same note. It's got an input, and below that, it's got another note and another input. And I've already labeled those inputs, input 1A and input 1B, considering they're relating to the first particular example we're looking at. So what I want to do first is take you into the notes computation layer script. And right now there's nothing in here, and a variable can be a letter, a series of letters, or a word that we want to use. So I'm going to go ahead and use the word variable here, and I'm going to put equals after it. When we type in a word or a series of letters and we put an equal sign after it, we're setting up the variable. Now, what do we want that variable to show? Well, we want it to come from input 1A. So I start typing input and I get choices for my component to draw from. And what do I want the source of input 1A to be? Well, in this first example, we wanted it to be a numeric value. So I'm going to choose numeric value, and that's as simple as it is right there. So now I've defined my variable, the word variable, as coming from input 1A, whatever the numeric value is. So I'm going to click done, and then to put my variable into the note, I usually skip a couple of lines here, and then I go over to this icon where we can insert a value from the computation layer, and I simply choose available variables. And I titled mine variable, so it just goes right there. So in preview mode, here's what we saw earlier. If the student types in a number like 7, here's that variable being displayed. Well, I also need to create a variable in my second note for LaTeX input. So I'm going to go into the script here, and I can use the word variable again. I could just simply use a letter like V equals. And then what component do I want to draw from? I want to draw from input 1B this time. And its source, these are the available sources here. I want to choose LaTeX notation. Then again, I insert the variable into the note. Here's the available variables. This time it's just the letter V. And if I click on preview, I have my first one still in there. And here's my second one. We can type mathematical notation. For an example, an equation. So that's pretty simple in getting started, how to create variables and use them. Let's look at a couple other examples. We can also use variables to input or to display text input. So if we wanted to ask students a question here and have them type a response, that will display right there. We can also use a variable to display a text input in a component here or another component. So Maybe we want to ask them, what's your name? And in this case, I'll type in my name, and you can see here it displays right above that, whatever that name would be typed in. Whatever letters are typed in here, that's displayed. So how do we go ahead and set this up? On this page, I've got a duplicate slide with a note and a text input box, and a little bit lower, a second note with that second text input box. And I've already labeled the text input boxes, text 1A and 1B. So let's go ahead and tie in a variable to connect to text 1A. I can again choose a word, a series of letters. I can make it be text equals, and then I want to choose the component I draw from. I'm going to draw from text 1A. And what do I want its source to be? Well, we have different sources that a text box can provide. We can choose content, or here are some of the other ones. To keep this simple, we're just going to choose content. So basically, whatever the student types in will be assigned to the variable text. I can insert the variable text in the note. And then in preview mode, whatever the student types in here shows up in that particular display because of the variable text. To create it down here and insert it in a certain spot, I'm going to do a similar thing, but I'm going to tie it to text 1B. And I might call this name equals. I'm going to draw from text 1B as my component in its source. I'm going to choose content again. Now, when inserting it into the note, I can choose to insert it wherever I'd like. So I'd already typed in my name is, and in that particular spot, I'm going to insert name. It shows up in a light green color here. And then when if a student were to type in a name, then it shows up right here in the middle of that particular message. The third example I'm going to look at in this video is using variables to generate random numbers and then display them. So here we're in edit mode. I just want to show you a preview of what this might look like. I've got an action button tied in here to the note. Rather than the student inputting something, they can simply click this action button, and each time they click the action button, we get a different random number. Now, sometimes those numbers duplicate. And let me show you how this works in setup mode here. I'm going to jump to another screen. And what we want to do first is set up our random number generator, if you will. Now, I can set the variable and call it random number generator, or I'm just going to use a simple R equals, R for random number. And then we're going to use a function, random generator. Now, if I want to tie it into an action button, I'm going to type in the word button, and I've already assigned the name button to my button, and then I want to use press count as its source. So basically what's going to happen here is every time the student presses the button, we're going to generate a different random number. Now we have to decide, what is that random number going to look like? What are the parameters? Well, to begin, I'm going to create a second variable. I might call this one display. And if I put an equal sign after it, it recognizes that we're starting to define a variable here. And I want that display variable to draw from the variable R that we created right above it. Now, what type of random number do we want to generate? There are two choices, integers and floating numbers. Floating numbers mean basically decimals. I'm going to keep it simple, and we're going to choose an integer. And then after that integer, I'm going to put in my arguments or my parameters. Let's say I wanted to generate a random integer between -5 and 12. Put -5, 12 in parentheses. We get no warning symbols. So now the display variable will depend upon the random number variable, and it will pull an integer between -5 and 12. So I want to put my display variable in my note. We'll do that just as we did before. And Just to show you down here in the action button here, I've given the button a label, get random number. And it's also identified right here. So let's see it in preview mode. The first number showing is 8. Then we go to 1. And each time the button is clicked, we get a different random number, anywhere between -5 and 12. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to using variables in Desmos Activity Builder.